The coach came apart on the third switchback below Cascades summit, its rear wheel catching a washed-out rut and flinging the whole carriage sideways into the mud, and Silas Prescott was already running downhill before the screaming horses had finished their panic. He had been 300 yards above the road, checking a game trail for elk sign, when he heard the crack of the axle and the driver's shout carried up through the wet pines. He did not think. He simply moved, boots skidding on rain-slick needles, his big shoulders shoving branches aside as though they were curtains, and by the time he broke onto the road the coach lay on its side in the ditch, two horses tangled in their traces and screaming, and a woman's arm was reaching out through the door that now faced the sky. "Hold still," he called, sliding the last few feet down the bank on his heels. "I've got you. Don't fight me." "I am not fighting you," came the reply, tart even through pain. "I am trying to get my satchel." He almost laughed despite the danger of it. He reached the coach and set his shoulder against the frame, testing its balance before he did anything foolish, because he had seen men crush trying to be heroes with an unstable wreck. The coach groaned but held. He reached down into the dim interior and found her hand first, small and strong, gripping his wrist with surprising force for someone who had just been thrown across a cab. "I'm Silas," he said, because it seemed important to say something human in the middle of chaos. "Give me your other hand." "Adelaide Sawyer," she answered, as though introductions mattered more than her ribs, and let him haul her up and out into the gray afternoon. She came out into his arms bodily, and for one long moment he was holding the entire weight of her against his chest, feeling her heart slam beneath her traveling coat, before he set her carefully on her feet on the roadbed. She was smaller than he'd expected from the strength of that grip, dark-haired, gray-eyed, her bonnet gone and her hair coming loose in the rain, and she looked up at him with an expression that had far more fury in it than fear. "The driver," she said immediately. "Is the driver hurt?" That she asked after the driver before herself told him something about her, filed away without his quite meaning to file it. He left her standing and went to the front of the wreck, where the driver, a thin, older man named Hobbs whom Silas knew slightly from Ridgeway Crossing, had been thrown clear, and was cursing steadily as he tried to stand on an ankle that would not hold him. "Don't stand on it," Silas told him, and Hobbs, recognizing the voice of a man used to being obeyed in matters of injury, sat back down in the mud. The two coach horses were still fighting the wreckage, and this was where Silas's hands truly proved their worth, because he waded into the tangle of leather and terrified horseflesh without hesitation, speaking low, cutting a trace with his belt knife when it would not unbuckle, and got both animals free and standing, trembling but unhurt beyond a scraped foreleg on the gelding. He was a big man, wide through the shoulders in a way that filled out his buckskin coat without any need for padding, his forearms corded with the kind of muscle that came from years of hard use rather than a smithy's forge alone, and the horses quieted under his hands the way frightened animals will quiet for someone who does not fear them. Adelaide Sawyer watched him work with an assessing eye that had nothing swooning in it. "You've done that before," she said, when he led the gelding over and checked the scrape on its leg. "More times than I care to count." He glanced at her satchel, still clutched to her chest. "Your papers matter that much." "They matter a great deal, yes." She did not elaborate, and he did not press, though he noted the guarded flick of her eyes, the way she held the satchel like it contained something more dangerous than correspondence. Between the two of them they got Hobbs propped against a fallen log with his ankle wrapped in a strip torn from the boot of the coach, and Silas set off up the road to bring back his own horse and enough rope to right the vehicle. By the time full dark threatened, the coach stood upright again, its axle lashed with green wood and rawhide in a rough splint that would get it the remaining 6 miles into Ridgeway Crossing at a walk, and Silas Prescott had learned that Adelaide Sawyer did not faint, did not weep, and asked more questions in one afternoon than most men asked in a week. "You are not from around here," he said, walking beside the slow-moving coach with the gelding's lead in his hand, since it could not yet safely carry a rider on that scraped leg. I am from Portland, by way of my father's house before that, which was in Ridgway Crossing itself, though I have not seen it in 11 years." She looked out at the black wall of forest climbing the ridges around them, rain beating on the brim of a spare hat she'd found in the coach's boot. "I have come to reopen the livery. It was my father's. He passed this spring." Something in Silas went still. "Thomas Sawyer's girl. You knew him." Everyone between here and Bend knew Thomas Sawyer. He did not say the rest of what he was thinking, which was that Thomas Sawyer had been the only man in 3 counties who had shod Silas Prescott's horse without asking about his past. Back in the early days when Silas had first come down out of the mountains with nothing to his name but a saddle, a rifle, and 11 years of running behind him. "I'm sorry for your loss, Miss Sawyer." "Thank you." She said it simply, without the theater some women put into grief for strangers to admire, and he respected her more for it. "I intend to reopen it. The livery, I mean. Not merely sell the land, as I understand certain parties in town would prefer." There was an edge in that last sentence that told him this was not idle information, and he filed it away beside the guarded look she'd given her satchel. The year was 1884, and the rains that fell on the western slope of the Cascades that autumn had been the worst in memory, turning the wagon road between Ridgway Crossing and the county seat at Sisters into a ribbon of clay soup that swallowed wheels to the hub and stranded travelers for days at a stretch. Ridgway Crossing itself sat in a bowl of land, where 2 forks of a nameless creek came together beneath the shoulder of a long volcanic ridge. The Wasco and Warm Springs peoples had hunted and traveled through for generations before any surveyor's stake had gone into that ground, and it was a settlement of perhaps 400 souls, most of them loggers, ranchers, and the merchants who served both. Silas Prescott had lived 11 years in a cabin 2 hours' climb above the town, in a fold of the mountains where the cedars grew thick enough to block the worst of the winter wind. And in all that time, he had told almost no one why he had first come there, nor what name he had carried before Silas Prescott, nor what warrants might still exist somewhere in a Wyoming courthouse for a young fool who had ridden with the wrong men for 2 desperate years, after the war left his family's ranch a burned shell and his father dead in the ashes. He had done things in those 2 years he did not speak of. He had also, in the last hour of a robbery gone to pieces near the Idaho line, put himself between his gang's guns and a terrified station agent's family, and taken a bullet through the shoulder for the privilege, and something in that moment of choosing to protect rather than take had cracked him open like a dropped stone. He had ridden away from the gang that night and never looked back, and he had come to the Oregon mountains because they were far from anywhere he had ever been known, and he had built a life there stone by stone, plank by plank, the way a man builds a dam against a flood he still fears might come. He shod horses for anyone who could not pay, when the need was plain and the animal was suffering, because Thomas Sawyer had once done the same for him, and because some part of him believed that if he kept giving away what he could give, the ledger of his life might someday balance out. He hunted for the widow Hutchins when her boys were too young to bring in meat. He had, 3 winters back, walked 11 miles through a blizzard to fetch the doctor for a birth gone wrong. Ridgway Crossing knew him as a quiet, capable, somewhat forbidding man who kept to himself and asked for nothing, and not one soul in that town knew his true name, nor the 12 months he had spent believing himself already damned before he chose otherwise. He walked beside Adelaide Sawyer's coach through the last gray hour of that ruined afternoon and felt, for the first time in longer than he cared to admit, something other than the careful watchfulness that had governed every human contact he permitted himself for 11 years. The town of Ridgway Crossing received the wrecked coach with the particular commotion of a small settlement starved for news, and by the time Silas had walked the gelding to the empty livery yard at the edge of town, a dozen people had already gathered to hear Hobbs's account of the wreck, embellished with each retelling, until Silas himself began to sound like something out of a dime novel. The livery stood exactly as Silas remembered it from the last time he had passed by, some months before Thomas Sawyer's final illness, though it wore the particular sadness of a building whose purpose had stopped. The main doors hung slightly open, the forge cold, straw scattered and gone to mildew in the stalls. A hand-lettered sign nailed crookedly to the gatepost read simply "Closed," and beneath it, added later in a different hand, "For sale inquire with Mr. Ezra Vance." Adelaide Sawyer stood in the yard with her satchel still clutched against her side and looked at that second sign for a long moment before she reached up and tore it down with one sharp motion. "That," she said, "will not be necessary." "You mean to keep it," Silas said. "It was not quite a question. I mean to reopen it precisely as I told you." She turned to face him fully now, and in the lantern light spilling from the nearby mercantile, he got his first true look at her face unclouded by rain and fear. She had a strong jaw, a straight nose with a small scatter of freckles across it that suggested more time outdoors than most city women would claim, and eyes that held his without flinching, gray as the storm clouds still hanging over the ridge. "My father built this business from nothing. I do not intend to let it be sold out from under his memory to settle some debt I have not yet even confirmed exists. You don't know if there's a debt. I know a man named Ezra Vance wrote to me in Portland within a fortnight of my father's death, offering to purchase the property at a price that struck me as generous for a livery in a town this size, and offering also to handle what he called the necessary paperwork regarding my father's outstanding accounts with the bank." Her mouth thinned. "I am a newspaper woman, Mr. Prescott. I have learned to be suspicious of generous men bearing paperwork." That was the first he learned her profession, and it explained something of the wariness with which she'd guarded her satchel through the whole ordeal on the road. "I edited a small paper in Portland for 3 years," she went on, apparently deciding he had earned some measure of trust after pulling her from an overturned coach. "Land matters mostly. Homestead disputes, boundary fraud, the sort of thing that makes powerful men uncomfortable, and therefore makes for a very thin advertising column." A wry twist touched her mouth. "I came here to bury my father and settle his estate. I did not expect to find quite so much smoke around a man named Vance in the process." Silas said nothing to that, though the name Ezra Vance settled into him with a small, unpleasant weight, because he had heard that name before, attached to a survey crew that had spent the summer working the ridge above town, and to a series of quiet purchases of grazing land along the creek that had struck more than one rancher as odd, though no one had said so above a whisper. He helped her get the livery's main doors properly latched against the weather, checked the cold forge with the practiced eye of a man who had done his own smithing for years out of necessity, and before he quite decided to say it aloud, he heard himself offering something he had not offered anyone in a long while. "I'll come by in the morning," he said. "Look over your stock if you've got any left and the shoes on whatever animals are boarded here. No charge. Your father never charged me when I first came to this country with nothing, and I've been paying that debt forward to whoever needed it ever since. Seems only right it should come back around to his own daughter, now that she needs a hand." Adelaide studied him in the lantern light, and he had the distinct sense of being weighed, the way a good judge of horseflesh weighs an animal before a purchase, looking past the coat and the size of him to something underneath. "That is a generous offer, Mr. Prescott." "Silas," he said. "Mr. Prescott makes me feel like somebody's schoolmaster." The ghost of a smile crossed her face, there and gone. "Silas, then, and you may call me Adelaide, since it appears we are to be neighbors of a sort, at least while I sort out this business with Mr. Vance." He touched the brim of his hat, an old habit from a life before this one, and turned to lead the injured gelding toward the boarding stalls. And if he walked a little straighter doing it, he told himself it was only the satisfaction of a day's work well done. Morning came gray and dripping, the rain having settled into the patient, endless drizzle that would define the whole of that autumn in the high Cascades, and Silas Prescott arrived at the livery before the town's few shops had opened, carrying his own set of smithing tools slung across the gelding he had walked down the night before. He found Adelaide already awake and working, sleeves rolled to the elbow despite the cold, mucking out a stall with more competence than he'd expected from a newspaperwoman, and something in his chest loosened at the sight of her there in her father's yard, doing her father's work. "You've done this before," he observed, echoing her own words back to him from the day prior. "I grew up in this livery, Silas Prescott. I mucked stalls before I could properly spell my own name." She straightened, pressing a fist to the small of her back, and eyed the tools he carried. "You meant it then, about the shoeing. I don't say things I don't mean." It became, over the following week, a kind of rhythm between them, one Silas had not planned and could not quite explain to himself even in the privacy of his own thoughts. Each morning he came down from his cabin through the wet trees, and each morning Adelaide had the horses ready for him, 3 animals that had been boarded at the livery when Thomas Sawyer died, and had simply stayed on with no one to collect them, plus a 4th belonging to a rancher named Whitfield who brought his gelding in specifically, because word had spread that the mountain man was shoeing for free at the reopened Sawyer livery. Silas worked the forge himself, since the bellows and anvil were sound even if long unused, and Adelaide worked alongside him more often than not, holding a hoof steady, fetching nails, asking questions about the trade that were sharper and more specific than idle curiosity would produce. "You could charge for this," she said on the 4th morning, watching him fit a shoe to Whitfield's gelding with the easy competence of long practice. "Vance is paying men to survey half the ridge above town. There's coin moving through this settlement. You needn't give your work away." "I don't do it for the coin." He tapped the shoe once more, checked the fit against the hoof, satisfied. "Your father gave me a debt I couldn't repay when I first came here. I do this because it's the only kind of interest that debt knows how to pay." "That's a strange way to speak of gratitude." "Maybe." He set the hoof down gently and straightened, meeting her eyes across the gelding's back. "Your father asked me once why I'd come so far from wherever I started. I told him some men need to put a mountain between themselves and their past before they can breathe right again. He didn't ask more than that. Just shod my horse, same as anyone else's, and told me the mountain would still be there whenever I was ready to look back down it." Adelaide was quiet for a moment, studying him with those steady gray eyes. "That sounds like a man worth honoring." "It is." Silas picked up his tools, aware that he had said more than he meant to, and more than he had said to another living soul in years, and yet the saying of it had not felt like danger, only like relief. "You favor him, you know, not just the trade of it. The way you look at a person like you're deciding whether to trust them, same as he used to." "And have I decided?" There was something almost teasing in it, though her tone stayed level. "Ask me again in a month," he said, and was rewarded with a genuine laugh, low and surprised out of her, as though she had not expected to laugh so easily in the town where she'd come to bury her father and fight a stranger over his legacy. It was during that same week that Adelaide began the work that had, in truth, brought her back to Ridgeway, crossing every bit as much as her father's estate had, though she had not said as much to Silas outright. She spent her afternoons at the county recorder's small office, a single room attached to the back of the general store, where an overworked clerk named Peterson kept deed books and survey filings in towers of dust-furred ledgers, and she began, methodically, the way she had learned to work in 3 years of chasing land fraud through the columns of a Portland newspaper, to trace the recent history of purchases along Ridgeway Creek. What she found troubled her more with each passing day. Ezra Vance, a well-dressed man of perhaps 50 who had arrived in the settlement only the previous spring, and quickly ingratiated himself with the county judge and 2 of the largest ranchers in the valley, had over the course of the summer acquired options to purchase nearly every parcel of grazing land along the creek's lower stretch, land that bordered a section the Warm Springs people had been assured, under an old agreement negotiated a decade before, would remain open to their seasonal grazing and fishing rights in perpetuity. The agreement itself, when Adelaide finally located a copy of it filed in the recorder's back room, buried beneath unrelated survey papers as though someone had wanted it overlooked, was written in 2 columns, English and a rendering of Southampton. And it was the Southampton column that stopped her cold, because even her limited knowledge of the language, gathered from a summer she had once spent reporting on treaty disputes near the Dalles, told her that the translation did not say what the English column said. Where the English promised permanent grazing and fishing access to the Warm Springs bands along that stretch of creek, the Southampton column, translated back by a schoolteacher she quietly consulted in the next settlement over, promised only access during such times as the land remains unclaimed by settlement, a qualification that rendered the entire protection meaningless the moment any settler filed a claim. It was not simply sloppy translation. The hand that had written both columns was the same hand, careful and even, and the discrepancy was too precise, too convenient to the interests of anyone wishing to open that land for purchase, to be accident. She brought her findings to Silas on a Sunday evening, the one day the forge stood cold, finding him at the small table in the Livery's front office where he had taken to sharing a meal with her most evenings, an arrangement that had begun as practicality, since she was alone in the town, and he did not care to see her cook for herself after a full day's work, and had become something neither of them named but both of them noticed. "Look at this," she said, spreading the copied pages across the table between them, careful to keep the lamp oil away from the ink. "Tell me if I am seeing ghosts, or if this is exactly the kind of thing I believe it to be." Silas read slowly, his lips moving faintly over unfamiliar words, and though his schooling had been rough and interrupted by war and worse, he had spent 11 years in these mountains trading with Warm Springs families who came down for supplies, and he had picked up enough of the language, spoken if not written, to catch the wrongness of it himself once she pointed toward the specific phrases. "This says forever," he said, tapping the English column. "This says until somebody else wants it." He looked up at her, and something hard had come into his face, a stillness she had not seen in him before, the stillness of a man remembering old angers. "Vance did this. I cannot prove who held the pen, not yet, but Vance has been the one buying every parcel this treaty was meant to protect, and Vance is the one who now stands to make a great deal of money selling grazing leases to ranchers who will not think twice about who used to fish that creek every spring." She sat back, rubbing her eyes, tired in the particular way that came from staring at close handwriting by lamplight for hours. "If this stands unchallenged, there will be settlers grazing cattle on ground the Warm Springs bands believe is guaranteed to them by treaty, and when that happens, Silas, it will not stay a quiet dispute in a recorder's office. Men have died over less." "I know it," he said quietly, and something in the flatness of his voice told her he knew it from more than hearsay, though she did not press him on it that night. "There's an auction coming. Vance has been talking it up at the Mercantile. Says the county's going to auction the unclaimed sections along the creek come the second week of next month, once the rain lets up enough for the roads to bear traffic. Says it'll be the making of this town." "Then that is when this must be stopped," Adelaide said, and there was a fire in her now that had nothing to do with the lamp between them. "Before a single acre changes hands under a lie." Silas looked at her for a long moment, this small, fierce woman who had ridden into a wrecked coach and a fight not of her own making and had chosen, without hesitation, to make it hers anyway, and he felt something shift and settle inside his chest, something he recognized, with the wary clarity of a man who had spent a long time guarding against exactly this feeling, as the first true stirring of love. "Then we'd best find out whose hand actually wrote that Southampton column," he said, "and we'd best do it before the second week of next month." The investigation that followed occupied the better part of 3 weeks, weeks in which the rain never truly stopped, only shifted between hard drumming downpours and the thin gray drizzle that soaked a man through no matter how good his coat, and in which the road to Sisters became so thoroughly ruined that the coach service suspended its runs entirely, leaving Ridgeway crossing an island unto itself, dependent on horseback riders willing to brave the mud for any word from the outside world. It was during this isolation that Silas and Adelaide's partnership deepened into something neither could any longer pretend was merely practical. He taught her, on the mornings when no horse needed shoeing, how to read the country the way a mountain man read it, how a stand of alder marked a wet spring even in dry season, how the particular call of a varied thrush changed when something larger moved through the timber nearby. She taught him, in turn, how to organize scattered facts into an argument that could not be easily dismissed, showing him drafts of the article she was quietly composing by lamplight, an article she intended to have set and printed the moment she could get to a press, whether in Sisters or, if the road stayed impassable, by sending the copy out with a writer bound for the Dalles. "You write the way you talk," he told her one evening, reading over her shoulder as she corrected a paragraph, close enough that he could smell the rain still caught in her hair. "Plain, no dressing it up more than it needs. My father used to say the same thing, though he meant it as a complaint about my letters home." A small smile. "I did not always write plainly. I learned it the way you learn to swing a hammer true. Enough wasted swings teach a person economy." "I know something about wasted swings," he said, and there was enough weight in it that she looked up at him, waiting, and he found himself, for the first time, telling her more of the truth than he had told anyone in 11 years. "I wasn't always a man who shod horses for free out of gratitude," he said slowly, watching her face for the flinch he half expected and did not receive. "Before I came to this country, I rode with men who took what wasn't theirs. 2 years of it after the war took my father and our ranch both. I told myself it was justice, taking from men who'd never lost anything the way we'd lost everything. It wasn't justice, it was just taking." He turned his big hands over, palms up, as though showing her the evidence of it. "Last job I ever rode on, we cornered a station agent and his family who had nothing to do with any of it, and one of my own men wanted to make an example. I put myself between that gun and those children, and I took a bullet through the shoulder doing it, and something in me broke that night. Adelaide broke in a way that let something better back in. I rode away, and I never went back, and I have spent 11 years trying to be a man worth the second chance I gave myself." The silence stretched long enough that he thought he had misjudged her entirely, that the newspaperwoman's instinct for justice would recoil from an outlaw's confession, regardless of how many years separated the man before her from the one he described. But Adelaide Sawyer had spent 3 years learning to see past a single fact to the fuller truth surrounding it, and what she saw now, in the lamplight, was not the outlaw of 11 years past, but the man who had spent every day since paying a debt no court had ever demanded of him. "You did not have to tell me that," she said finally. "No, but I did not want to be a man who let you fall in love with only half of him." He said it plainly, the way he said everything, and watched her eyes widen slightly at the word, though she did not pull away. "That is a bold thing to say to a woman who has not yet admitted to any such falling. Have you not?" His voice was quiet, almost gentle, though his eyes held hers with the same steadiness he brought to a frightened horse. "I have watched you work a forge you'd never touched a week before, and argue land law with a county clerk twice your age until he backed down, and hold a lantern steady over a breech berth 2 nights past when Mrs. Calloway's mare could not foal easy, and not once in all of it have you looked at me like a woman waiting to be rescued. I don't know what I expected to find when I pulled you out of that coach, Adelaide, but it was not this." "And what is this?" she asked, very softly. "Someone I do not have to be strong for," he said. "Someone strong enough on her own that what I have to offer is not rescue but company. I have not had that in longer than I can remember." She reached across the small distance between them and laid her hand over his, where it rested on the table, and the touch of it, simple and warm and deliberate, settled through him like the first sun after weeks of rain. "Then let us be company to each other," she said, "and see where the road leads once the mud finally clears." He turned his hand beneath hers, palm to palm, and did not let go for a long while. The next escalation came not from the land dispute directly, but from a rider who arrived in Ridgeway Crossing 3 days later, half frozen and half drowned, bearing word that a delegation of Warm Springs leaders, having heard rumors of the coming auction and the treaty's supposed limits, intended to come down from the reservation to Ridgeway Crossing themselves to confront the matter before the auction could proceed, and that feeling in the settlement, stirred up for weeks by careful talk from men in Vance's pay about savages threatening peaceful ranchers' grazing rights, had grown ugly enough that more than one rancher had taken to carrying a rifle into town. Adelaide heard this news standing in the mercantile, and she felt the old cold clarity settle over her that she associated with every story she had chased that mattered, the sense of watching a fuse burn toward a keg she could not yet reach. She found Silas at the Livery, currying the Whitfield gelding with long, even strokes, and told him what she had heard. "They mean to come to the auction itself," she said, "to speak for their own rights, since no one else will speak truly for them. And half this town has been told for weeks that they mean violence instead." Silas set down the curry comb, his jaw tight. "Vance has been buying more than land. He's been buying fear, cheap and easy, because fear sells faster than facts ever will. Then we give them facts faster than he gives them fear." She squared her shoulders, and he recognized in the gesture the same instinct that had made her demand after the driver's welfare before her own on the day of the wreck. "I have the treaty copy. I have the schoolteacher's honest translation, written and signed. What I do not have is proof of whose hand actually altered that document, and without that, Vance will simply call it a clerical error and weather the storm." "Then we find that proof," Silas said, "and we find it before that delegation rides into a town primed to meet them with rifles instead of respect." It was Adelaide who thought first of Peterson, the overworked recorder's clerk, a nervous, honest man who had clearly been troubled by something for weeks but had lacked either the courage or the standing to say so aloud. She went to him alone the following morning, not with accusation but with the patient, careful questioning she had honed over years of interviews, and found that Peterson, once assured that she meant to expose Vance rather than the clerk who had merely filed what he was told to file, was willing to talk. He told her that Vance had brought the treaty document to him for filing the previous spring, already prepared, already signed by the previous county surveyor, a man named Coombs who had left the territory for California only weeks after and could not now be easily questioned. Peterson had noticed the discrepancy between columns himself, being of Warm Springs descent on his mother's side, and possessing enough of the language to read it plainly. But Vance had made it clear, through means Peterson described only as certain understandings about a man's continued employment, that questioning the document's accuracy would not be welcomed. "He kept the original," Peterson said, glancing nervously at the office door as though Vance might materialize through it. "The draft before the fair copy was filed. Coombs's actual survey notes with his true translation, the one he took down from the interpreter at the original signing. I know because I filed those loose papers myself, in the general survey ledger, thinking no one would think to look for them there since they weren't part of any formal deed." Adelaide's heart quickened. "Would you show me where?" Peterson hesitated only a moment before nodding, and led her to a battered ledger 3 shelves back. And there, folded inside pages recording an unrelated timber survey from 2 years prior, she found Coombs's original field notes, water-stained but legible, showing the true translation in Coombs's own hand, matching precisely what the schoolteacher had rendered for her, along with a marginal note in Coombs's writing that read plainly, "Fair copy to be prepared per Mr. Vance's specification," and beneath it, damningly, a second note, Discrepancy noted but paid to proceed as instructed. It was not merely evidence of fraud. It was a signed confession, however oblique, that the fraud had been deliberate, purchased, and known to at least 2 men before Vance had ever brought the falsified fair copy to the recorder's office for filing. She copied the pages carefully, her hands trembling slightly with the particular excitement of a journalist who has finally found the fact that breaks a story wide open, and thanked Peterson with a sincerity that left the nervous clerk looking, for the first time in weeks, as though a great weight had lifted from him. She brought the copies to Silas that evening, and together they read Coombs's notes by lamplight, and Silas felt something in him settle even further into certainty, not merely that Vance was a fraud, but that Adelaide Sawyer was exactly the kind of woman who could stand up in a room full of angry, frightened men and make the truth impossible to ignore. "This is enough," he said. "This is more than enough if we can get it in front of the right eyes before that auction." "We will need more than the right eyes," Adelaide said. "We will need the right ears and the right timing, and very likely a great deal of courage from people who have spent weeks being told to be afraid instead of honest. Then we'd best start finding out who in this town still has some honesty left in them," Silas said, "because I suspect there are more than Vance would like to think." The days leading up to the auction took on the taut, waiting quality of a held breath. Silas continued his shoeing each morning, though word had begun to spread beyond mere gossip that the mountain man and the livery owner's daughter were digging into something that touched Ezra Vance directly, and more than one rancher who had quietly resented Vance's rising influence began to find reasons to bring a horse in for shoeing, and to linger afterward talking with Silas about the coming auction in tones that suggested they, too, had begun to smell something rotten beneath Vance's careful respectability. Adelaide, for her part, rode out twice during that final week, once to the schoolteacher's settlement to secure a sworn written statement of the accurate translation, witnessed and signed, and once, with Silas riding beside her at her own insistence rather than his overprotective suggestion, up toward the reservation boundary itself, where she met with 2 of the Warm Springs leaders who would be part of the coming delegation, a measured, careful man named Thomas Meninock and a younger man, sharp-eyed and wary of white intentions after years of broken promises, named Charlie Queemps. It was a delicate meeting, conducted with Silas mostly silent beside her, offering only the occasional word of the language he had picked up in his years in the mountains, enough to show respect without presuming fluency he did not possess. "Why should we trust a newspaper woman we have never met?" Charlie Queemps said, not unkindly but not warmly either, "when every white paper document we have ever signed has been turned against us in the end." "You should not trust me simply because I say the words you wish to hear," Adelaide answered, meeting his eyes without flinching, a directness that seemed to surprise him. "You should trust the document itself in Mr. Coombs's own hand, admitting the fraud was deliberate. You should trust that I intend to print this truth in a paper that will be read from here to Portland, whether Ezra Vance likes it or not, because that is the trade I have built my life on, and I will not abandon it now for the sake of convenience." She paused. "And you may judge for yourselves when you come to that auction whether the facts I bring hold up under your own questioning, because I do not ask you to take anything on faith. I ask only that you come prepared to hear the truth spoken aloud, in a room full of people who have been told for weeks to fear you instead." Thomas Meninock studied her for a long moment, then looked to Silas. "And you, mountain man, what is your part in this?" "I shoe horses in this valley for anyone who needs it," Silas said. "Yours included, if ever you've a mind to bring one down to Ridgeway Crossing. I don't much care what a man's name is or where his people come from, only whether he treats his animals right and deals honest with his neighbors. Vance has done neither, far as I can tell, and I mean to see that come out plain, same as Adelaide does." Something eased slightly in Charlie Queemps's expression at that, though he did not smile. "We will come," he said finally. "We will come to hear the truth spoken." What happens after that will depend on whether the truth is enough. Riding back down toward Ridgeway Crossing in the thin, cold light of late afternoon, Adelaide was quiet for a long stretch, and Silas, sensing the particular weight of her silence, did not press her until she spoke first. "Do you think it will be enough?" she asked. "The truth, I mean. I have seen it fail before, Silas. I have watched men with money and good tailoring talk their way around documents that should have condemned them 10 times over." "I don't know if it'll be enough on its own," he admitted. "But I know a lie can't stand forever against a truth spoken loud enough, in front of enough witnesses, by someone who won't back down from it. And I have never once seen you back down from anything." He glanced sideways at her, the rain beating in his dark hair, longer now than when she'd first met him, curling slightly at his collar in the damp. "Whatever happens at that auction, you will not face it alone. I mean to be standing right beside you when it comes." "I know," she said, and the simplicity of her trust in it settled something in him that had been unsettled for 11 years. They stopped, without quite planning to, at a bend in the trail where the trees opened onto a view of the valley below, gray with rain but beautiful in the particular way that wet, wild country could be beautiful, all deep greens and silver mist, and Silas reached over and brushed a strand of wet hair back from her face, his rough fingers gentle against her cheek in a way that surprised them both with its tenderness. "Adelaide," he said low, "I have not let myself want much of anything in 11 years for fear of what wanting might cost me. But I want this. I want you, and whatever this life might look like if you'd have me in it." She turned her face into his palm just slightly, an answer before words came. "I have spent 3 years believing that a life devoted to the truth left little room for anything as soft as love. You have shown me I was wrong about that." She reached up and covered his hand with hers where it rested against her cheek. "I would have you in my life, Silas Prescott, outlaw's past and mountain man's silence and all of it. I would have all of you." He leaned down, slow enough to give her every chance to turn away, and she did not turn away, and their first kiss was soft and searching, rain-cold at the edges and warm at the center, the kind of kiss that asked a question and received its answer in the same breath. When they finally parted, he rested his forehead against hers, and for a long moment neither of them spoke, content simply to breathe the same damp mountain air. Two people who had each spent years guarding themselves against exactly this kind of surrender, finally choosing to lay that guard down together. "We still have an auction to survive," she said eventually, though there was a smile in it now that had not been there before. "Then let's go survive it," he said, "together." The auction had been set for the second Saturday of the month, timed by Vance's own arrangement to coincide with a brief break in the rains that everyone in the valley had come to distrust, since the mountains rarely gave more than a few days of clear sky before the clouds rolled back in from the coast. The county had erected a temporary platform in the open lot beside the courthouse in Sisters, the nearest town large enough to host such a gathering, and word of the sale had drawn ranchers and speculators from as far as Bend, along with, as promised, a delegation of some 20 Warm Springs men and women led by Thomas Meninock and Charlie Queemps, who arrived at dawn on horseback and drew stares and mutters from a crowd that had, indeed, been primed for weeks to see their presence as a threat. Adelaide had spent the previous evening at the small print shop in Sisters, having ridden ahead with Silas 2 days earlier to secure the setting of her article before the auction itself, and copies of the Sisters paper's special edition, carrying her carefully documented account of the fraudulent treaty translation, alongside a facsimile reproduction of Coombs's original notes, had been distributed through the crowd that very morning. Though she knew a printed page could only do so much against a crowd, already gathered with money in hand and old fears in their hearts. Ezra Vance himself arrived precisely on time, immaculately dressed despite the mud, flanked by 2 men Adelaide recognized from Ridgeway Crossing as recently hired hands, with the particular watchful bearing of men paid more to intimidate than to work. And he mounted the auction platform with the easy confidence of a man who believed the day's outcome already settled in his favor. The auctioneer, a county official named Grissom who owed his position at least partly to Vance's influence, called the crowd to order and began reading the description of the first parcel. Land directly bordering the creek section, the falsified treaty had supposedly opened. And it was at that moment that Adelaide Sawyer stepped forward from the crowd, her satchel in hand, Silas at her shoulder, and raised her voice to carry across the muddy lot. "Before this sale proceeds," she called, "I would ask this assembly to consider evidence that the treaty under which this land is being offered as unclaimed was fraudulently translated, and that Mr. Ezra Vance was aware of that fraud at the time he arranged for its filing." A murmur went through the crowd, and Vance's composure flickered just slightly before he mastered it. "Miss Sawyer," he said, his voice carrying the smooth, patient tone of a man accustomed to talking his way past inconvenient truths, "I understand grief has been hard on you since your father's passing, but I would caution you against making accusations you cannot substantiate in front of witnesses." "I can substantiate them precisely," Adelaide answered, and drew from her satchel the copies she had made of Coombs's field notes, holding them aloft. "These are the original survey notes of Mr. Coombs, the surveyor who prepared the treaty document you filed in his own hand, showing the true translation of the agreement, which promises the Warm Springs Band's permanent and unqualified access to this land for grazing and fishing. I have also a sworn statement from a schoolteacher fluent in the Sahaptin language, confirming that the filed document's translation was deliberately altered, and a marginal note in Mr. Coombs's own writing acknowledging that the alteration was made at your specific instruction, and that he was paid to proceed despite noting the discrepancy himself." She began to read the marginal note aloud, her voice clear and steady despite the growing murmur of the crowd, and Vance's face had gone pale beneath his careful composure. "This is preposterous," he said, too loudly, the smoothness cracking at its edges. "A single clerk's marginal scribble proves nothing. I purchased these parcels in good faith, believing the recorded treaty accurate." "Then you will have no objection," Adelaide said, "to Mr. Peterson, the county recorder's clerk who filed both the fraudulent fair copy and the original notes, confirming under oath precisely what instructions he received and from whom." Peterson, who had been standing near the back of the crowd with the particular misery of a nervous man forced into public reckoning, stepped forward at this, his hands shaking slightly, but his voice, when he spoke, carried clear enough for the crowd to hear. "It is true," he said. "Mr. Vance brought me the fair copy already prepared and made it plain that questioning its accuracy would cost me my position. I filed the original survey notes separately because I could not bring myself to destroy evidence of the truth, though I lacked the courage to speak of it until now. I am ashamed of that silence, and I will not compound it with a lie today." The crowd's murmur had become something closer to a roar, ranchers turning to one another with expressions ranging from disbelief to dawning outrage, several of them realizing in that moment that they had been prepared, through weeks of Vance's careful talk, to view the Warm Springs delegation as a threat to grazing rights that had, in fact, been legitimately theirs all along, stolen not by the delegation's presence but by Vance's pen. It was at this precise moment, with the crowd's temper shifting like a wind-changing quarter, that one of Vance's hired men, sensing the day slipping from his employer's control, made the mistake of reaching for the pistol at his hip, perhaps meaning only to restore order through intimidation, perhaps meaning something worse. Silas saw the movement before most of the crowd registered it, and he moved with the same speed and certainty that had carried him down the mountainside to a wrecked coach weeks before, closing the distance and catching the man's wrist before the pistol cleared its holster, twisting it with enough force to make the man cry out and drop the weapon into the mud without ever firing a shot. "There will be no gunplay here," Silas said, his voice carrying the particular flat calm of a man who had seen enough violence in his life to know exactly how quickly it could spiral beyond anyone's control, and who wanted no part of adding to that count now. This is a matter for the truth to settle, not lead. Charlie Queemps, who had watched the entire exchange with the wary readiness of a man expecting exactly this kind of violence, stepped forward now, and the crowd, perhaps surprised by his composure in the face of an armed threat against his delegation, quieted to hear him. "We did not come here seeking a fight," he said, his voice carrying clearly across the lot. "We came seeking only what was promised to us in good faith 10 years past. This woman has shown you the truth of what was taken from that promise, and this man has shown you that truth need not be defended with violence, only with courage enough to speak it plainly. We ask this assembly to judge us by that truth, and not by whatever fear has been sold to you these past weeks." Grissom, the auctioneer, looked to the county judge, who had been standing near the platform throughout the proceedings with an increasingly troubled expression, and the judge, a man named Halloran who had clearly not been party to Vance's fraud but who had also clearly benefited from looking the other way regarding it, finally stepped forward to address the crowd himself. "In light of the evidence presented," Halloran said, his voice heavy with the particular reluctance of a man forced to admit an error he should have caught sooner, "this auction cannot proceed on the terms originally intended. I am suspending the sale of these parcels pending a full review of the treaty's original terms, and I will personally see to it that the accurate translation is filed and honored, as it should have been filed from the start." Vance, seeing the crowd's mood turn irrevocably against him, made one last attempt at composure, addressing the ranchers directly. "Gentlemen, surely you can see that a delay serves no one's interests. The grazing land you need remains available regardless of this technical dispute over translation." But the crowd had already turned, the same fear that Vance had spent weeks cultivating now curdling into anger, directed squarely at the man who had manufactured it for his own profit. And it was one of the ranchers himself, a heavy-set man named Corwin who had been among Vance's earliest and most vocal supporters, who spoke the words that finally sealed the day's outcome. "I bought 2 of your grazing leases on the strength of that treaty being void, Vance," Corwin said, his voice thick with anger. "If that treaty was never void at all and you knew it, then you sold me stolen ground and took my money doing it. I want every cent of that back, and I expect there's others here feeling the same." The murmur that followed had the particular quality of a dam breaking, half a dozen voices raising similar grievances. And within the space of a few minutes, Ezra Vance found himself facing not the compliant crowd he had arranged the auction to please, but an assembly of angry, defrauded men demanding restitution, while Judge Halloran, sensing the shift decisively, announced that he would be requesting the territorial marshal's involvement to investigate the full scope of Vance's dealings. It was not, Adelaide reflected later, the clean and total victory of a novel's ending, because Vance would not be dragged off in chains that very afternoon, and the marshal's investigation would take weeks to conclude properly, and there would be lawyers and further hearings before every defrauded rancher saw restitution, and before the treaty's true terms were formally restored to the county's records. But it was, unmistakably, the truth breaking through where a lie had stood, and it was enough, in that moment, watching the crowd's fear curdle into the beginnings of justice, for her to feel the particular fierce satisfaction that had first drawn her into newspaper work all those years ago. Silas found her at the edge of the lot afterward, the crowd still buzzing with argument and recrimination behind them, and he took her hand without ceremony, simply holding it, and she let him, feeling the rough, warm strength of his fingers around hers like an anchor after a long storm. "You did that," he said. "All of it. I only stopped a man from drawing a gun. You're the one who broke that lie wide open." "We did it," she corrected him. "You found the courage to speak up when it counted, same as Peterson did, same as the delegation did. A truth needs more than one voice to carry, Silas. It needs a whole chorus of people willing to say it plainly when it matters." She squeezed his hand. "You have been part of that chorus since the day you pulled me out of that coach." They rode back toward Ridgway Crossing that evening in the company of the Warm Springs delegation for the first several miles. An easier, warmer traveling party than the tense ride-out had been. Thomas Meninock riding alongside Silas for a stretch and speaking with him in a mixture of English and the Southampton phrases Silas had picked up over the years. And by the time the delegation turned off toward the reservation boundary and the road narrowed back down toward the settlement, something had shifted in the valley's temper that Adelaide sensed would outlast even the coming legal proceedings. A first thin thread of trust, rebuilding where fear and fraud had nearly torn it apart entirely. The weeks that followed brought their own quieter dramas, though none so cinematic as the auction itself. Ezra Vance, facing both the territorial marshal's investigation and a growing chorus of defrauded ranchers demanding their money back, quietly departed the county before the marshal's inquiry could formally begin, though word eventually reached Ridgway Crossing that he had been apprehended some months later in California, attempting a similar scheme involving irrigation rights, and would face trial there for fraud on a scale that made his Oregon dealings look almost modest by comparison. Judge Halloran, perhaps eager to distance the county's reputation from the scandal, moved with unusual speed to see the treaty's accurate translation formally filed and recognized, and personally rode out to the reservation to deliver a written apology on behalf of the county, an act that Charlie Queemps received with the same careful, wary grace he had shown throughout, neither fully forgiving nor entirely dismissive, but willing, at least, to acknowledge that the truth had finally been given its proper weight. The rains, true to the season's pattern, closed back in within days of the auction, turning the roads once more to their familiar treacherous mud, and Ridgway Crossing settled back into the rhythm of isolated mountain life, though it was a town subtly changed, its people a little less willing to accept comfortable lies simply because they arrived dressed in good tailoring and generous offers. Adelaide's article, expanded now with the full account of the auction itself, ran not only in the sisters' paper but was picked up, through the efforts of a former colleague, by a Portland publication with a far wider readership, and within a month she had received 3 separate letters, one from a homestead family near the Dalles and 2 from ranchers further south, each describing similar patterns of quiet, official-seeming fraud along contested boundary lines, each asking whether the newspaperwoman who had exposed Vance might be willing to look into their own troubles as well. She sat with those letters spread across the small table in the livery's front office one evening in late November, the rain drumming steady against the roof, and found Silas watching her with an expression she had come to recognize as the particular quiet pride he wore when she did work that mattered. "You could go," he said, before she had to raise the question herself. "Follow these stories wherever they lead. I would not ask you to stay simply for my sake, Adelaide. I told you once I wanted company, not a woman caged to my comfort." "I know you would not ask it," she said, setting the letters aside and reaching across the table to take his hand, the gesture as natural now as breathing. "But I find, Silas Prescott, that I do not wish to chase every story that finds me clear across 3 territories, leaving this livery to fall back into ruin, and leaving you shoeing horses alone up here while I go hunting other men's frauds." She turned his hand over in hers, tracing the calluses across his palm, evidence of a life built on hard, honest work. "My father built something real here. I mean to keep building it, and I find I would rather answer these letters by post and travel out only when the story truly demands my presence in person, than abandon what we have begun here for the sake of chasing every fire I hear of." "We," he said softly, catching the word. "We," she confirmed. "The livery, this town, whatever we choose to build together in it." She met his eyes, steady and sure. "I have spent 3 years believing that a life devoted to truth left no room for roots. You have shown me that a person can plant both silos, truth, and roots together if they choose the right ground to plant them in." He came around the table then, drawing her up from her chair and into his arms, and the kiss they shared this time held none of the tentative question of their first, but rather the settled certainty of two people who had chosen each other fully, with clear eyes and full knowledge of what that choosing would cost and what it would give in return. They were married in the spring, when the roads had dried enough to allow travel, and the mountain snowmelt had swelled the creek to its noisy, joyful springtime rush, in a small ceremony held in the livery yard itself. Among the horses Silas had shod through that long, hard winter, and the neighbors who had come to know Adelaide's courage and Silas's quiet, steady strength in equal measure. Thomas Meninock and Charlie Queemps rode down from the reservation to attend, a gesture of respect and reconciliation that moved more than one person in the crowd to tears. And Peterson, the nervous clerk whose courage had helped break Vance's fraud wide open, served as a witness to the signing of the marriage certificate with a steadiness that suggested he had found, in speaking one hard truth aloud, the confidence to face the world a little less fearfully ever since. The livery itself had, by that spring, become something more than Thomas Sawyer had ever built it to be. Not merely a place to board and shoe horses, but a gathering point for the valley's business. A place where ranchers and homesteaders alike came not only for Silas's steady hands and continued generosity toward anyone in genuine need, but for Adelaide's clear-eyed counsel on matters of land and law. Her small printing press, purchased with the proceeds of her Portland publication fees, humming quietly in the back room where she continued, in modest measure, the work of shining light into corners that powerful men preferred left dark. On a clear evening some months into their marriage, with the long Cascade twilight settling gold and soft over the ridge above town, Silas found Adelaide in the yard, watching the horses graze in the last of the light, and came to stand beside her, slipping an arm around her waist in the easy, unthinking way of a man who had finally, after 11 years of careful solitude, allowed himself to belong fully to another person. "Your father would be proud," he said, watching the animals move slow and content across the yard, "of what you've built here, of what we've built. He would be proud of you as well," she said, leaning into him. He always did have a good eye for judging a man's true character, past whatever name or history a person carried with them. "I think he would have liked you very much, Silas Prescott, outlaws past and all. I like to think he already gave me that judgment. First time he shod my horse without asking a single question about where I'd come from." Silas pressed a kiss to the top of her head, breathing in the familiar warmth of her, hay and ink and rain all mixed together into something that had become, over the course of one long, hard, transformative year, the very smell of home. "I spent 11 years believing the mountain was the only thing that could keep my past from catching up to me. Turns out all it took was a woman brave enough to face her own storms head-on, and generous enough to let me stand beside her while she did it. And a mountain man foolish enough to shoe every horse in the valley for free," Adelaide said, smiling up at him, until the whole town could not help but notice what a good man he truly was. "Foolish," he agreed, "or maybe just finally ready to be found." They stood together in the fading light, the creek running clear and full below the ridge, the horses grazing peaceful in the yard that had once stood empty and closed, and around them the valley settled into the particular deep quiet of a place at peace with itself, its old wounds beginning, slowly and honestly, to heal. Whatever storms might yet come, whatever fraud or fear might someday again test the fragile trust rebuilt between the settlement and the people who had called that land home long before any survey stake had marked its boundaries, Adelaide Sawyer and Silas Prescott would face them as they had faced this first great trial together, with clear eyes, steady hands, and a love that had been forged, like good iron, through fire and patience both, until it could hold whatever weight the years ahead might ask of it. The rain would come again, as it always did in that country, turning the roads once more to mud and isolating the settlement within its ring of dark, dripping trees. But within the walls of the livery that Thomas Sawyer had built and his daughter had reopened, with the forge kept lit by a mountain man who had finally found a reason to let his guarded heart stand fully in the open, there would be warmth enough, and light enough, and love enough to outlast any storm the mountains cared to send.